Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to have a chat with you guys a bit about insulin resistance. So, talking about what insulin is, why we care about it, why you see a lot of people throwing these terms around, and what are the things which actually matter when we worry about it and try and engage with it. So, the first place I would start us by thinking about is, what does insulin actually do? I often conceptualize insulin as very much like a storage hormone. It's a bit of a shelf stacker. So the food arrives in your bloodstream via your stomach, right? You eat, ideally, goes into your guts absorb it, right? It's a lot like the truck delivering food to a grocery shop. So the food will sit in a warehouse, sit out the back. It's going through your bloodstream. But having a lot of glucose or a lot of sugar in your blood isn't really that useful unless we can find ways to get it into our tissues. This is where insulin comes in. Insulin's role is to get it out of your blood into the tissues. So when your blood glucose is high, insulin secretion increases to pull it back in your tissues, particularly things like our fat and our muscle stores. So I often call it the proverbial shelf stacker. So, when we talk about this, we're talking about insulin resistance, like it's a pathology, right? Something can go wrong. And the way I often get people to think about this is foundationally, we become insulin resistant because we have too much insulin hanging around and it can't do its job quite as well. So, it can come from a few reasons. We can literally just have too much secretion. We can have too much body fat. Our mitochondria might not be working as well. We get increased cellular stress, a whole bunch of things. But the way I want you to think about it is this. If you have normal insulin resistance, you're quite healthy. If you eat a food, as you can see here, our blood glucose tracks up. As it starts creeping up, you secrete insulin, the glucose goes back into the cell, and we end up nice and flat. Everyone's happy. That's super normal. If you have some insulin resistance, so if you're pre-diabetic, what you'll see happen is you'll eat the food, your body will secrete insulin, but for every unit of insulin you secrete, you don't do quite as well at putting that sugar into your cells. So what happens is the peak gets a lot higher. Because that peak gets a lot higher, what happens? You get more secretion. So it becomes this feedback loop. And the thing we care about isn't really so much the peak as it is the area which sits under this curve. So as you can see here, we have a lot of area under this curve, not much area under this one. If you progress and you become diabetic, what we see is this huge increase in area under the curve. And that's where a lot of those problems start to come from and arise. So look, we've all been in the fitness industry or been around health and fitness long enough to hear people say things like sugar is bad, sugar is toxic, sugar is bad for your tendons, sugar is bad for your eyes, it is bad for your nerves, it's bad for COVID. I saw that one a bit. And often they don't actually, well, they might mean dietary sugar and they haven't read the research, but often what the research says about this is it's actually the prolonged elevation of your blood sugar levels. So what is it? It's actually your insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance, which is the thing we care about, as opposed to actual sugar intake. Because if you're not as good at that, if you're not as good as putting the sugar, the glucose into your cells, we do see things like poor healing, worse muscle gains, worse immune function, nerve problems, kidney problems, blood vessel problems. It's not a great state to be in, and it's part of why so many disease states can be made worse by having something like type 2 diabetes. So, how do we fix this kind of problem? I've broken down the fixes into three categories for you guys, just so it's simple. Nutrition is the absolute easiest, so I'm going to hit you with it right now. The easiest way to improve your insulin resistance is to eat in a caloric deficit. There are studies suggesting that intermittent fasting can help this, but it seems to only be useful insofar as it reduces body fat and total calorie intake. Some of the initial rodent research was super, super promising here. I did my honors year in a lab where we did some of it, and we did some protein manipulation stuff for it too. The initial rodent work was super promising, but the problem is when we talk about often when we talk about fasting in rodents, it's actually alternate day feeding. So they eat every second day, they don't eat at all for a day, which people don't do. And when we look at what that time span is like relative to rodents and their like circadian rhythms and body cycles, it's not the same as a human eating every second day. It's the same as a human eating every week or every couple of weeks. So, for nutrition, the biggest thing to care about is driving a caloric deficit. If you were someone who is already diabetic or has insulin resistance, talking about that right now is significantly out of my scope. And I would say go talk to a dietitian. We've got two great ones on the team here at FNC, and they're going to be in a much better position to assess you and your individual circumstances. If you're someone who is concerned about this, though, the other one to refer out for is pharmacology. I'm a person you know from the internet, most likely. You probably shouldn't take advice on what drugs to take from me. And that's probably a bigger lesson, really, too, about communication and science. But I'm going to talk a bit about what we can do here with our nutrition, with our movement, to try and improve those kind of outcomes. So, as this may hint, the good news is all we need to do is simply move more. The evidence says two really nice things. One, we don't have to train particularly hard because so much of the metabolic benefit, things like mitochondrial function, starts getting improved at a really low intensity threshold. What seems to matter more is the total amount of minutes of work we do. So we're talking once you get north of 115 minutes of low intensity aerobic work a week, we get great improvements. If you go higher though, it continues to get better for quite some time. So that is 8,000 steps a day a week in this case, but we want to get over 8,000 steps a day across your week. So I often tell people to think of it less as of an average, but thinking of it as a minimum requirement per day when we talk about step targets, because so much of that benefit is in the consistency of that stimulus. But if you want to push this higher, the evidence supports that it continues to get better. The other way I'd encourage you to think about it, if you've just seen a doctor and you've gotten a bad score for your a random blood glucose or a fasted blood glucose, if it's a problem right now, you probably just need to have a conversation of how do we add extra movement in. So the other good news, like I touched on, is that the intensity is the thing that matters the least. The volume matters way more. So if you think about the intensity of the exercise you work at, the initial components are almost entirely going to be aerobic metabolism. So consider this, you're walking, you break into a jog. We have a bit of energy metabolism, which comes from anaerobic sources, and the remainder comes from aerobic metabolism. So if you go absolutely flat out, say if you tried to run for 3, 5, 6 minutes, as hard as you could, you're not actually doing much more aerobic work than you would have if you'd just done work in this kind of zone. So start walking, get moving around, find those ways just to slightly increase the amount and the frequency of the movement you do across your day. So yeah, the big takeaways I want us to have here is that lifting weights alone may not be quite sufficient if you go to the gym 3 or 4 times a week, but then you sit around all day. If you're worried about this, one, I would say see an appropriate medical health professional. But also, I'd encourage you to have a look at your lifestyle, have a look at your behaviors, and ask yourself how you can move more. 115 minutes across 7 days is not a lot of work. So it could be as simple as you getting off the train one stop earlier. It could be as simple as you parking further away in the supermarket. Just small behavioral tweaks to try and drive a little more movement. Hey, you can even set an alarm at work, get up, stretch your legs every 25 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour. Plenty of solutions there. And the other thing I want to drive home is like the flip side of this discussion is that sugar isn't as problematic as it is an opportunity cost where that amount of calories could have other nutritional value. And if you have a good metabolic health and you're moving a lot, having a higher sugar intake isn't necessarily problematic. And in fact, it may be required in order to sufficiently fuel yourself. I hope you guys have taken something out of that. If you've enjoyed it, I'd be keen for you to reach out, let me know. Keen to hear what you think.